What up, pilots? So I wanted to talk about the Zero in War Thunder and basically test out something. Specifically, its dive speed. So I'm in Afghanistan because it spawns me at 10,000, and all I gotta do is climb 5,000 feet rather than take off out on airfield and then climb up to altitude to dive to show this. So basically cutting down on video time here. I got a couple different variants. Well, I have 9 of them actually. I'm not going to use them all. I'm just going to use, a couple of the M2s, maybe a couple of the M3s, and then show the M5 and its dive speeds. Um, but I wanted to talk about basically how their zeros are broken in the game. Okay, let me just put it that way. They don't perform the way they should. They overperform actually, specifically when it comes to mostly its speeds. Higher speeds, they should be a little bit unresponsive, but they aren't. That's all I was gonna show. I'm also not the type of channel that's gonna go into the flight data. What kind of, was the engine turbocharged? Was it supercharged? What kind of airfoil did the airframe have? What kind of octane fuel did the aircraft use? Like, I'm not that type of channel, okay? When it comes to a lot of the Japanese aircraft, the Japanese military did destroy a lot of the records, a lot of the test flight data, and just flight data in general. The records, the Japanese military did destroy them, or they went missing, so there's not much that we know. A lot of the information that we find is one source says one thing, one source says another. It's pretty mixed match. But if we take it and then kind of find like a common denominator for all the information that we have on a lot of the Japanese aircraft, we do know for sure that the Americans captured an A6M2, and they found out that the aircraft was unresponsive at higher speeds, and it also turned to the left. It had a problem with turning to the left. So because of that, the Americans found out that to fight it, if you dove away from it, started a right-hand turn opposite of the problem, it didn't turn right very well, I should say, to put it simply. It extended out and then climbed away from it and gained distance and then did hit and run tactics. That's how they found out how to fight the Zero. So, like I said, I'm not gonna get into all the huge flight data. We don't really have any flight manuals of the aircraft themselves because, I mean, like I said, the records were destroyed. They probably burnt a lot of the flight manuals they had on the aircraft. So, but what I do know, well, what we do know, I should say, is that the Zero had problems with high speed and problems with a left-hand turn. So we're at 16,000 feet. So the American pilots, a lot of the American test pilots said that the Zero, the A6M2 model, had a problem with at over 280 knots. It started to be unresponsive. So let's dive. These are also unspaded, by the way. So there's 280, and we can pull out of that dive just fine. 300 knots, we can pull out of that dive just fine. All right. Now we should compress. To be generous, they said about 280. 280 knots is like what? It's 500 and something kilometers an hour. Let's look. Yeah, 518 kilometers an hour. All right. So let's dive again. So if it's 280 knots or 518 kilometers an hour, that's when the Zero starts to become unresponsive. To be generous, we should be compressing really bad at 320 knots So historically, let's say that it was about 300 knots, which was about 500 and I want to say 40 kilometers an hour. But to be generous, let's say it's actually 320 knots, which is 592 kilometers an hour. All right. So let's go ahead and dive again. This is the float plane version, by the way. So we will break our floats in this one. I'm gonna dive a little bit more than I did last time. 300. So we should be compressing right now, and I can't turn, but we're still diving just fine. We might break our floats in a second. There they go. There goes one anyway. But we're still pulling just fine out of this dive. Like, totally responsive. And then starting a turn. I mean, the only thing that really happened there was that we blocked out, which is to be expected, but 300 and what was it, 350, 360 knots true airspeed, and we were totally fine and totally pull out of that dive. Let's go ahead and switch models here. These are unspaded too, so when you spade aircraft out, they get more engine power, and also their airframe gets stronger too, so I mean, the flight models for simulator mode at least make it a little bit more historically accurate. Gaijin, there's a reason why people play simulator mode, to be a little bit more accurate with the flight model or flying in general. It's also more satisfying because it's more challenging. But arcade and realistic mode, I mean, who cares about the flight models really? I mean, because it's arcade and realistic. Even though realistic says realistic, it's really not realistic at all. But it's Zeros and a lot of the turn fighters of Japan that don't compress when they should. The A6M, the Zero, the A7M, the Key 43, and the Key 44, they don't compress when they should. They did do some flight model changes on some of the Japanese aircraft. I think it was less than a year ago. I think it was like maybe 6 months ago, something like that. They made the Key 61, the Key 100, and I think the J2Ms a little bit heavier. They made it feel a little heavier, which, okay, that's fine, but they should make it. They're still light aircraft. They should accelerate faster. Specifically, the Key 61 and the Key 100. They should accelerate faster than they do. All right, we're diving in an A6M 2, 380 knots, and let's pull right out of it. Pull straight out of it. Oh, we wing ripped. Nice. But I should have wing ripped without even pulling the stick, though. That's the thing. We should be compressing and or wing ripping sooner. Whoops. Let's go with the M3, not the M2. So I pulled, what was I doing? 380, I think. 380 in true airspeed, I believe it was. And I started pulling real hard to get out of the dive. and then we wing ripped at like, what was it, 360, 370? Well, we should be wing ripping at like 330, compressing and or wing ripping at 320, 330-ish. So like 40 to 50 knots sooner. I know there's probably going to be somebody in the comments section talking about how zeros aren't, there's nothing wrong with them. They perform like they should. I mean, they do perform like they should. The only problem is they don't compress like they should. That's what I'm saying. On top of that is the A7M and the Key 43. They should, the A6M, the A7M, and the Key 43 should compress a lot sooner than they actually do. The Key 61 and the Key 100 should accelerate a little bit better. J2M, they're pretty decent. Keep them the same. The J7W, those are pretty good, and leave them the same. Key 84, those are pretty good. The N1Ks, those are pretty decent too. They need to fix the A6M, the A7M, and the Key 43 and the Key 44. Make them compress a little bit sooner, or wing rip a little bit sooner if you pull too hard, trying to pull out of the dive. So like 40 to 50 knots sooner, so like 320, 330 knots. And they should compress so bad that you can't pull out of the dive, so they're unresponsive at that speed. And then the Key 61s and the Key 100s, they should accelerate a little bit faster. Other than that, Japan is fine. That's the problem with Japan. People fly it because they're so easy to fly, and they're broken. A lot of the aircraft are broken. Alright, let's go ahead and dive. Now, this is the clipped wing version, so this one does dive and roll a little easier, a little better I should say. We probably will also wing rip with this one, but we're not compressing. I can still pull the stick, but we're not compressing. But we did wing rip, but we should have wing ripped a lot sooner. We finally wing ripped it. I think it was what, 380, 390 true airspeed, 370, 380, something like that. When it should be wing ripping and compressing at like 320 or 330. Let's go with M3 Mod 22. Nah, that's good enough. 14,800 feet. Yeah, we should be compressing now, but we're not. 380 knots. We're doing just fine. I'm gonna pull out slowly, pull straight out of that dive. I pulled straight up at 350 knots. We shouldn't have been able to do that. We should have wing ripped. We should have compressed. Should have wing ripped. So yeah, there's the A6M mod 22. This one you'll break your floats. Obviously, I showed you that. The M2s, they about perform the same in a dive. These M3s all perform about the same in a dive, and then the M5s all perform about the same in a dive too. The worst of all, when it comes to the flight model and how inaccurate the flight model is, the M5 is the worst. Let's go ahead and spawn in one of the M5s here. Yeah, the M3s and the M5s are the worst. So to be generous, if the American pilots said, and some of the data that we could find said that it was, the pilots said that it was about 280 knots where they became unresponsive, and some of the sources say it was like 290, some say it was like 300-ish. To be generous, let's say in War Thunder simulator mode that all the zeros would compress at 320 knots. That's being generous, which is 592 kilometers an hour. And that's when they compressed. And that's when you couldn't pull out of a dive. 320 true airspeed, not indicated. So true airspeed, that's also being generous. Okay, let's say that that's good for like the M2s and the M3s. Let's say with the M5, to be generous again, it's 330. Let's go 340. Totally 340 knots or 630 kilometers per hour, where they totally became unresponsive in a dive or at that speed with the M5 models. And also with the M6, because I know there's the A6M C, excuse me. Say that 5 times fast. So all they would have to do is just fix the compression speeds to about 320 to 340 knots, and then it would totally fix the problem. Because if I'm in a Zero and I'm able to dive after a P-47 or after a P-51, and then that P-51 or that P-47 levels out, one, I shouldn't be able to dive with him. I should be compressing. Two, if I did pull out of the dive and now we've leveled out and they're running away and extending away, I shouldn't be able to keep up with them. I should be losing speed quickly. But you don't in a Zero. And that's what's broken about them, is their speed retention, and they don't compress. That's what's broken about them. Alright, we're at 16,000. Let's dive. This will be the last Zero I show. So we're going to dive straight down. 320 we should be compressing. 340 we should be compressing. We're not. 400 knots. 420 knots true airspeed. And we finally wing rip. We went over 400 knots in a Zero before we wing ripped, when we should have wing ripped at like 50 knots sooner than that. So like 350, 360-ish knots. rather than it said 399 indicated, which I was going 420 something true airspeed. So when are they gonna fix it? I don't know. But let's hope they fix Japan soon. The flight models on the turn fighters, just make them so they compress easier, or 40 to 50 knots sooner than they actually do right now. And the Key 61 and the Key 100s, they should accelerate a little faster too. Other than that, that's what they need to fix. So yeah, there you go. Zeros are broken.